Joining us now is Dr. Jeanine Weekes Schroer. Dr. Schroer is a philosopher of race and feminist theory and an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota Duluth. Dr. Schroer, thank you for coming on tonight's show. What can your research tell us about the current state of affairs regarding the issues of race and racism?
Well, my research covers a broad swath of questions around race and racism and is specifically aimed at thinking about the politics of things like social justice movements and the ethics. I'm interested in understanding what individual folks can do to respond to complicated systemic structures. So my research is basically all about trying to figure out how to address the circumstances that we're in right now.
And Jeanine, and I hope you don't mind me calling you Jeanine, but why do we find it so hard to discuss the issues of race and racism?
We have been participant in a very long-standing story about what racism is and about how we should understand it and about how we should respond to ethical questions, respond to it, that is dysfunctional. The story we've been told is a lot about how bad racist people are and how horrible racism is. And it's not that that's inaccurate, but what it does is it makes people very uncomfortable with engaging in the subtler aspects of racism that are part of what keeps it running every day, what are part of not things like the officer that actually killed George Floyd, but things like the many city managers, the many middle managers who ignored complaints against that officer, and the folks who wrote the handbooks that explained exactly when and how you're allowed to apply pressure to a human's neck as a matter of force for a police officer. Those folks don't conceptualize themselves as part of racism, but their actions are definitely part of the structure that causes racial harm.
You know, we've been hearing a lot lately about systemic racism, and what exactly is meant by that term?
So I would say that the right way to understand systemic racism is to understand the fact that the way that our society is built is such that it fosters injury against people who are members of the marginalized racial groups that is meant, at the very least, to benefit members of a considered to be superior group. And that it's not pertinent whether you personally in your heart harbor feelings of hostility towards members of groups. What matters is that this structure is built in such a way that various moves you make maintain it and maintain its ability to do harm.
You know, I know that you've done some research on that and microaggressions. And how do microaggressions pertain to the issue of systemic racism?
I think one of the really important jobs that microaggressions do is that they keep the story going exactly the way it is. The challenges of microaggressions is that people often don't understand that the thing that they do, the thing that they say is committing a harm, is part of a story of a harm. So you ask a sort of brownish person where they're from, and this implies that they're exotic, this implies that they're other, this implies that they're not part of you, that they weren't born in the city, that they're not part of your community. And that may or may not be what you intend, but it's part of what you communicate, not just to that person, but to everybody within earshot. You keep telling the story about who's part of us and who isn't. And microaggressions do that work every day on this very low level that allows us to maintain this sort of overall perception of our innocence about racial harm.
You know, there's a great quote by Toni Morrison, and I'm only going to paraphrase it, but she makes the case for race being a social construct, and that there's only one race, of course, the human race. Do you agree with that?
Well, I'm a constructivist about race. I do believe that the right way to understand what we're doing when we use racial language is we're talking about the way our society is composed. We historically have taken ourselves to be talking about something about bodies, but that's part of the work that that concept does in constructing our society.
Wouldn't a better term be, instead of race, maybe talk about culture?
So the challenge is, and the reason why we have racial language and we use that instead of culture, races don't have cultural identities. And here's what I mean, right? I'm African American, Black is my preferred vernacular. I have some things in common with some Black folk. I don't have some stuff in common. I don't have a lot of things in common with other Black folk. Culture usually is about really substantive commonalities in how you live your lives. The purpose of race as a concept was to tie identity to the body in a way that was immutable, to make people into categories that they couldn't escape. Talking about culture is a better way for us to go forward because it tells you more real facts about a human person. But culture doesn't do the work that race does because the work that race does is about dividing us.
Along the same line, what about white privilege? Is there such a thing as white privilege?
Sure. I think the easiest way to conceptualize it is to think about video games. There are games that have different difficulty settings. So white privilege is a way of having your game set at a relatively low difficulty setting. It doesn't mean that there's no challenges. It doesn't mean things are always easy. It doesn't mean that there won't be devastating and horrible things that happen to you. It just means that in the context when those things happen, there will be more ease than it would be if you had it set at a higher difficulty setting. So white privilege is real. It doesn't mean that your life is easy or perfect. It's just easier comparatively to somebody who might be identical to you except for their race.
You know, we've heard off and on over the years some horrible stories. The Tillman boy who was murdered, other horrible stories, but there's one I think that just is so horrendous, and that is the Tulsa Massacre. And I don't think a lot of people know about that. And what can you tell us about that?
The Tulsa Massacre is it's an event that occurs in a lot of towns' histories where, similar to what happened here in Duluth, a big accusation was made against a young Black person. And the law responded however it did, but facilitated or ignored a hyper response from a white community, a young Black person supposedly committing offense against a young white person. And that community came forward and acted with outrageous and extraordinary violence. In Tulsa, I believe 35 or 36 people ended up being dead, 25 or 26 Black people, and 10 white people, as well as thousands who were hurt. After a mob came forward to supposedly promote and provoke justice in what turned out to be a non-crime.
You know, when we hear about these things and how do we get past them, and I've heard that restorative justice and reconciliation is one way to go about that. But what can you tell me about the two terms? How do they differ from each other?
So the right way, I think, to think about sort of reparation or restorative justice versus reconciliation. Reconciliation justice is a practice that's meant to bring parties together, usually especially for the hope of coming to some common perception, and possibly for establishing a shared view of what an accountable party can do to make right the injury that they've caused. Reparation involves a recognition that sometimes a harm that's been done can't be reconciled. When you take the lives of 3 young men, what you have to do is to pay back a history of harm, not just sort of make right with a particular individual, because sometimes that's not available. The history of lynching in this country has devastating injury that goes far beyond the already egregiously high penalty of young folks losing their lives. The legacies are loss of property, loss of wealth, an ongoing history of poverty, lack of access to sort of meaningful resources in society like education, healthcare, lack of trust. Reparations is about understanding the extraordinarily large injury that's been done and recognizing that you can't just talk it out.
You know, I understand you're a philosopher too, and as such, is there anything that gives you hope during this time? Is there hope during this time of, I don't know, unrest and unease across the nation?
I don't know if it's my personality or my race, but I'm always hopeful. I have to believe in humanity's capacity to do better. And I am hopeful because it does seem like at this particular moment, there has been a recognition of white supremacy that is heretofore unconsidered. Not in my lifetime. Even sort of prior major historical recognitions don't have the sort of complexity and subtlety and depth of the perception worldwide that there is this real thing called white supremacy, and it has been doing systemic harm, and that we do have to start listening to the folks who describe it that way.
And Jeanine, just like I mentioned to Jordan, I think we're just touching the surface of this issue. Thank you for coming on to this show.